Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into Khushwant Singh's absolutely beautiful classic autobiographical story, The Portrait of a Lady. Now, if you've ever struggled a bit with the older language or maybe catching the subtle themes in this text, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're going to break down the main ideas in easy English, compare the key shifts in the narrative, and dive deep into the vocabulary and critical thinking questions so you can truly master the story. Here's our roadmap for the analysis. We'll start by meeting the grandmother. Then we'll track their changing relationship, look at the final chapter of her life, do a little vocabulary practice, and finally wrap things up with some critical thinking. Section 1. Meet the grandmother. A portrait of pure serenity. Right off the bat, Khushwant Singh hits us with this profound imagery to establish his grandmother's deep, peaceful presence. He writes that she was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity. She isn't just described as old, she's an expanse of pure peace and contentment. It perfectly paints a picture of a woman who is completely comfortable in her own skin, just living in her own quiet routine. To put it in simple, easy English, the story paints her as a deeply religious elderly woman. She was short, slightly bent with age, and her face was just a crisscross of wrinkles. She hobbled around the house, always dressed in spotless white clothes, keeping her balance with one hand on her waist while the other was constantly telling the beads of her rosary. Her lips were literally always moving in inaudible prayer. To the author, as a kid, she wasn't pretty in the conventional youthful sense. In fact, the idea of her ever being young seemed almost impossible to him, but she was undeniably beautiful in her gentle, constant presence. Moving to Section 2, a changing relationship. From village companions to city strangers. You can really see the relationship break down into 3 distinct phases, showing this gradual physical and emotional drift as the author grew older. In the first phase, early childhood in the village, they were constant companions. She woke him, dressed him, walked him to school. But then we hit the second phase, the city turning point, when his parents sent for them. They shared a room, but that deep bond began to snap. Finally, the third phase, university and going abroad for 5 years. At that point, he was given his own room, and the physical separation became almost total. So why did that drift happen? We'll look at the stark contrast between his schools. In the village, the school was actually attached to a temple. The priest taught the alphabet, and the grandmother could literally sit inside reading scriptures. But the city school? He took a motor bus, he started learning Western science, things like Archimedes' principle and the law of gravity. There was absolutely no mention of God or the scriptures, which deeply distressed her. And the final straw? Music lessons. To her traditional mind, music had lewd associations. It was meant for harlots and beggars, definitely not gentlefolk. That cultural clash essentially ended their daily conversations. Section 3. The final chapter. The homecoming and a silent farewell. Now, this is where things take a really surprising turn. When he initially left for 5 years, she showed absolutely zero sentimentality at the train station, just silent prayers and a kiss on his forehead. But upon his return, after years of quiet spinning and praying, she completely changes her routine. She spent her final healthy evening collecting the neighborhood women and vigorously thumping the sagging skins of an old, dilapidated drum to celebrate his homecoming. She literally had to be persuaded to stop so she wouldn't overstrain herself. The very next morning, she fell ill with a mild fever, calmly declared her end was near, and passed away peacefully, her fingers still telling her beads until they fell from her hand. And then we get what is arguably the most moving image in the whole explainer. Remember the thousands of sparrows she used to feed? In the city, feeding those birds had become the absolute happiest half hour of her day. Well, on the day of her funeral, the birds gathered around her body in complete absolute silence. There was no chirping. When the author's mother threw them breadcrumbs exactly the way the grandmother used to, the sparrows took absolutely no notice. When the corpse was carried away, they just flew away quietly. It is such a powerful testament to the impact of her gentle soul, transcending even human relationships. Let's pivot a bit for Section 4, Vocabulary and Language Practice, unpacking Khushwant Singh's words. Okay, let's look at the word revolting. Normally, we think of this word as meaning something gross or physically sickening, right? But in this context, when people told the young narrator that his grandmother had once been young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. To a child, the thought that this ancient, serene, unchanging woman had ever been a young girl seemed entirely absurd, undignified, and just utterly impossible to believe. It offended his fundamental understanding of who she was. Next up, we have frivolous rebukes. Even though she seemed quite stern and silent to the human members of the household, she showed a much softer, almost playful side to the birds. As they perched on her legs, her shoulders, and even her head, creating a total mess, she never shooed them away angrily. Instead, she offered frivolous rebukes, these light-hearted, playful scoldings that really showed her deep affection for them. This next part is just a brilliant showcase of how flexible English can be. Look at how Khushwant Singh uses 4 entirely different senses of the word tell in this one story. Telling the beads means counting them while reciting prayers. When he would tell her English words, it meant giving information. When he thought one could never tell if she'd survived the 5 years he was away, it meant being sure. And when she told us her end was near, it meant making a profound fact known. One simple word, 4 completely different meanings. Taking a quick look at grammar, it's really vital to notice the author's heavy reliance on the past perfect tense. Think of phrases like she had been old or the sun had lit her room. So why do this? Well, the past perfect form is used when we recount things in the distant past. It creates this sense of deep memory and reflection, placing the grandmother's existence in a completed, almost legendary time frame for the narrator. Finally, Section 5, Critical Thinking Questions. Let's test your understanding. So think back, what were the 3 main reasons the grandmother was so disturbed by that city school? First, she was highly distressed by the complete lack of teaching about God and the scriptures. Second, she couldn't understand or help him with the Western science he was learning, like gravity and Archimedes' principle. And third, the absolute deal-breaker was the music lessons, which she believed were monopolized by harlots and beggars, completely inappropriate for gentlefolk. Now, would you agree she was a person strong in character? Absolutely. For sure. Consider her silent resilience throughout the whole story. When their bond of friendship snapped in the city, she didn't complain. She accepted her seclusion with resignation. When the author left for 5 years, a time when most people would break down crying, she showed zero emotion at the railway station, lost entirely in her prayers. And most powerfully, she dictated exactly how her final hours would be spent, choosing to pray rather than waste her final breaths talking, ignoring her family's protests. That is just immense strength of character. I'm going to leave you to reflect on this final universal thought. Khushwant Singh paints a portrait of a very specific, deeply traditional woman, but the feelings of love, distance, and eventual loss we see here are completely universal. Who is the strong, silent anchor in your own life? And when the inevitable happens, how do you process that silence? Think about it and use this incredible story as a lens to view your own relationships. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning,